Hello everybody, hope you're doing well and thanks for joining us for another video. It's pretty common whenever you hear flat earthers talking about Antarctica, they bring up the name Admiral Byrd, and they often bring him up as evidence that the Earth is supposed to be flat. Now, Admiral Byrd was a naval officer and polar explorer who, amongst his achievements, is credited with the first flight to the North Pole, one of the earliest non-stop transatlantic flights between the US and France. However, in the context here, he's probably best known for leading Operation Highjump, a US naval deployment to Antarctica in 1946 to establish the Little America 4 research station. And this is where the conspiracies start. I actually heard Flat Earth Dave just the other day on a radio show being asked about Admiral Byrd, and this is what he had to say.
So Admiral Byrd did Project Highjump, again the high land, and he went down there with a huge armada of planes and ships and everything. And there were stories of the planes crashing into an invisible barrier. There's a story, but he went on the national news back in the 60s or whatever it was, and he said that there's more land beyond the South Pole, bigger than the United States, that no human has ever seen upon. So where they were coming from, a base called Little America, lands beyond the North Pole would be in between Africa and Australia. I think somebody would notice lands bigger than the United States out there. But he said it's out there filled with resources, and then 6 months later he was dead. Right? Just a coincidence, I'm sure.
Though Dave isn't the only flat earther to make these claims.
But we don't know how it terminates. We don't know how far it goes. Like you said, Admiral Byrd, the only real eyewitness we have, snuck it in on television that well, what I saw was a continent the size of America on the other side of Antarctica.
He flew beyond Antarctica 5,000 miles, according to his records, and he said that he found there many, many lands and peoples 5,000 miles beyond Antarctica.
Admiral Byrd comes back onto national television, and they continue to explore Antarctica throughout the 40s. You get to like 54, Admiral Byrd, that same guy, comes on national television and says, "It's astonishing to me that there's a landmass as big as the continental U.S. on the other side of the South Pole that no one knows about, with tons of land and resources."
Now, amusingly, Admiral Byrd gets cited by flat earthers for this claimed unexplored land, which they say is the size of the United States beyond the ice wall, and as Dave has claimed here, that planes supposedly crashed into the firmament, but also he gets cited by hollow earthers that claimed he's talked about there being cities underneath Antarctica and finding UFOs.
But he admitted that Admiral Byrd didn't just fly over Antarctica, he actually entered inner Earth. Watch.
Honestly, ladies and gentlemen, he flew 1,200 miles with the wind in his back into the inside of this planet.
Admiral Byrd went to go see what was going down in Antarctica, and he shows up and he's met with Nazis and aliens.
Well, straight away, those two ideas seem to contradict each other, and the flat Earth argument makes no sense. They contradict each other because hollow earthers say Byrd witnessed UFOs. Well, where would UFOs be coming from on a flat Earth when there's no space? And Dave's claims relating to flat Earth makes no sense because how would Byrd know that the land that had never been seen by people was the size of the US if it was completely unexplored? And if there was an invisible barrier that planes were crashing into that would stop them from travelling there, how would they see how big it actually was? Yes, they had planes with them, but this was back in 1946. They were relatively small propeller planes, and yet even in modern jets today, if you're flying at high altitude, say right over New York, you can't see San Francisco. In fact, you can only see about 250 miles at most. So, what really happened with Admiral Byrd in Antarctica? Well, Operation Highjump wasn't even Byrd's first rodeo to Antarctica. He'd led an expedition there in 1928 to the Ross Ice Shelf and set up the Little America base camp. During this trip, he actually flew to the South Pole. This expedition actually led to him being promoted to the rank of Rear Admiral. Then he led a second expedition to Antarctica in 1933, where he spent 5 months alone at a meteorological station. He then led a third expedition in 1939, though he was recalled back to the US in early 1940 for active service, but the expedition continued for another year or so without him. It was then following the conclusion of the Second World War that Byrd was assigned to run Operation Highjump to Antarctica in 1946, so this was actually his 4th time going there. But what unexplored lands did he find? Well, it's probably easiest to let Byrd himself explain.
Is there any unexplored land left on this earth that might appeal to adventurous young Americans?
Yes, there is. And not up around the North Pole, because it's getting crowded up there now, because they find out it's really usable, not only to live in, but militarily. But strangely enough, there's left in the world today an area as big as the United States that's never been seen by a human being. And that's beyond the pole on the other side of the South Pole from Middle America. And I think it's quite astonishing that there should be an area as big as that unexplored.
This is a tremendous
So
challenge.
there's a lot of adventure left down at the bottom of the world.
Admiral, do you hope to see that?
I do.
So, he does indeed say there is an area the size of the United States currently unexplored. However, he also explains that the land is on the far side of the South Pole from Little America, which Flat Earth Dave does mention, but manages to get the conclusion fantastically wrong.
So where they were coming from, a base called Little America, lands beyond the North Pole would be in between Africa and Australia. I think somebody would notice lands bigger than the United States out there.
As mentioned earlier, Little America were research stations that were set up on the Ross Ice Shelf. So from the Ross Ice Shelf, across on the other side of the South Pole, was unexplored. Now, this makes sense because by the time of Operation Highjump, there'd been a few dozen expeditions to Antarctica by various countries. However, most were focused on setting up research stations or whaling stations at locations along the shoreline. Very few expeditions had ventured deep inland. The ones that did were mainly focused on trying to reach the South Pole. After the South Pole was reached in 1911, the next big milestone for explorers was to cross Antarctica, which was attempted by Ernest Shackleton's Imperial Trans-Antarctic Expedition in 1914. However, that expedition ultimately was a failure, with their ship being lost and no attempt even made to try and reach the South Pole. The first crossing of Antarctica didn't take place until the late 1950s with the Commonwealth Trans-Antarctic Expedition, but that went from the Weddell Sea to the Ross Sea, basically the shortest possible route, and missed out most of Antarctica, the region known as Greater Antarctica. In fact, the first expedition into this area of Antarctica didn't take place until 1955 with the first Soviet Antarctic expedition. That was almost 10 years after Operation Highjump. And this interview with Admiral Byrd was from an episode of Longine's Chronoscope from December 1954. More than 2 years before Byrd's death, not 6 months like Dave claims.
But he said it's out there filled with resources, and then 6 months later he was dead. Right? Just a coincidence, I'm sure.
And a year before the first expedition into Greater Antarctica. This is the region of Antarctica that Byrd was referring to as being unseen by human eyes. Yet Flat Earth Dave, talking about the land being between Africa and Australia, seems like he's suggesting Byrd was claiming there was land the size of the US beyond the continent of Antarctica, when he was actually referring to exploring inland in a continent that was already known about. Now, you could think, okay, maybe he's misspoke, but this isn't the first time that Dave has made those claims.
Antarctica, there's land bigger than the United States on the other side of the South Pole. That would be in between, for us, from where it came from, it would be in between Australia and South Africa. Do you think if there was another continent size of the United States that they would have noticed it by now?
I mean, you could say, okay, maybe he's just struggled to visualize it, but he managed to screw it up once when he had a globe on screen with him.
So, Middle America, right here. Yeah. Crossing over Antarctica, crossing the pole, puts another continent near Africa and Australia, bigger than the United States that no one has ever set foot upon. Where is it? I thought he said Middle America, but it's from Little America. So let's say Little America was their base right here. He says, crossing the South Pole, there's more land bigger than the United States that no human has ever set foot upon, filled with resources. Well, that would be over here. Don't you think people in Australia,
some people,
Africa would see it?
Some people may say, well, Antarctica is the same size or bigger actually than the United States. And that's what he meant by that.
Well, no, he said there's more land beyond the pole. Beyond the pole. Beyond the pole is out here.
The overall size and shape of Antarctica was known about long before Operation Highjump, so Byrd knew how much of it was unexplored. Captain Cook had circled Antarctica nearly 200 years earlier, way back in the 1700s. Here's some maps from the late 1800s that show the size and overall shape of the continent. In fact, here's a map from Byrd's second expedition in 1934, and it's even labelled with the areas that at that point were unexplored. So no, Admiral Byrd didn't discover additional land to Antarctica, he merely remarked that much of Antarctica at that point hadn't been explored. Much like how explorers had discovered America, Asia and Australia back in the 15 and 1600s, yet they were still discovering islands dotted around the Pacific for more than 100 years after. Like Hawaii wasn't discovered until 1778. That area of the Pacific wasn't outside of the realm of the world, it was simply within an unexplored region that was surrounded by regions that were already explored, just like inland in Antarctica. Byrd already knew the region before Operation Highjump and that it was on a globe, not only made clear by his own maps showing Antarctica as the globe-shaped continent, not an ice wall, but also by the fact that his own description of the land's location was beyond the South Pole.
And that's beyond the pole on the other side of the South Pole from Middle America. So there's a lot of adventure left down at the bottom of the world.
A location that can't exist if the Earth was flat. As for Dave's claims about planes crashing into invisible barriers,
and there were stories of the planes crashing into an invisible barrier,
there seems to be only one record of a serious aircraft incident during Operation Highjump, which was on December 30th, 1946, a PBM-5 flying boat crashed during a blizzard. It seems clear from the wreckage that the plane broke up when it hit the ground, not hit an invisible barrier in mid-air, and there were 3 fatalities. However, there were also 6 survivors, which would be unlikely if a plane had broken up in mid-air. And the incident took place at Thurston Island, which is on the coast of Antarctica, further north than areas which had already been explored by that point. Admiral Byrd did briefly return to Antarctica one final time with Operation Deep Freeze in late 1955, though he stayed in Antarctica for only a week before beginning to journey back to the US. Operation Deep Freeze continued without him. It was the beginning of a permanent US presence on the continent. There also appears to be no record anywhere to support the claims of Hollow Earth either. Byrd is on record talking about unexplored regions of Antarctica, but I found nowhere that he himself talks about finding civilizations underneath Antarctica. In fact, the only thing I found him talking about being underneath Antarctica was natural resources.
What are the natural resources there?
Well, we've found enough of coal within 180 miles of the South Pole in a great ridge of mountains. It's not covered with snow, enough to supply the whole world for quite a while.
Well,
that's the coal. Now, there's evidence of many other minerals. We are pretty sure there's oil. Now
there's estimated to be around 500 billion barrels of oil underneath Antarctica. That's about 15 times more oil than is present underneath Greenland. These untapped natural resources has caused a lot of rising tensions between countries trying to lay claim on the territory.
Admiral Byrd, is there a competition among other nations to try to get information about Antarctica and possibly to secure some of these resources?
Well, yes. There are now 7 nations very much interested. Russia is interested tremendously. That I'm sure of. Australia has an expedition down there. The Argentine, the Chile, New Zealand, Britain, and so on.
and were a driving factor towards the Antarctic Treaty Agreement. Another flat Earth favourite where they say you can't freely and independently explore Antarctica because of the treaty, because they're trying to hide something. Now, claims over the Antarctic territory had been going on for decades, with various countries having landed expeditions at various parts of the Antarctic coastline and surrounding islands. The countries then were laying claim to those bits of land. For example, here's a stamp that was issued by Chile in 1940 showing a portion of the Antarctic territory which Chile claimed was theirs. However, Argentina objected to the claim, saying it overlapped part of their territory. Seemingly, this dispute is actually still ongoing. Then, with the proximity of this region to the Falkland Islands, in 1943, the British, concerned about German U-boats and resupply vessels being in that area, conducted Operation Tabarin, which was a secret operation to establish bases at abandoned locations around the peninsula of Antarctica. Well, as you can imagine, that went down like a ton of bricks with the Chileans, who then conducted the first Chilean Antarctic expedition in 1947 to try and shore up their claim of the territory. There was further conflicts around the region as well. In 1952, an Argentine military shore party fired machine guns towards a British Antarctic survey team as they were unloading supplies from one of their ships. One of the bases that the British set up during Operation Tabarin was on Deception Island. In 1953, the Argentine Navy sent ships to the area to construct the Scientific Research Station, and in response, on February 15th, 35 Royal Marines landed at the station, detained 2 Argentines that were stationed there, and destroyed the base. So there was quite a lot of tension about who held what parts of the Antarctic territory. Then, with the rising tensions of the Cold War as well, it was decided to draw up the Antarctic Treaty to de-escalate things. Hence, the treaty prevents military activities within Antarctica, only scientific are allowed. And given the fragile environment of Antarctica, it prevents countries trying to mine the resources. It certainly doesn't prevent people from going to Antarctica, as flat earthers claimed, which was proven in 2024 by us going to Antarctica. Sure, flat earthers have now shifted their claim to say, okay, maybe you can go to Antarctica, but you can't freely explore Antarctica because they're trying to hide the secret parts, which again is wrong. You can, sure, you need permission to enter the territory, but then I can't go to the United States without first requesting permission to travel there. Does that make the US a conspiracy as well? But that's going to be it for this video. As always, feel free to leave your thoughts in the comments down below. If you enjoyed this video and you haven't already done so, then please do consider hitting the like and subscribe buttons, and hopefully we'll see you in the next video.